The NHL is known for a lot of things. Unfortunately, big player moves aren't one of them. It seems like nowadays players are tied down to long-term contracts long before any potential free agency, and big blockbuster moves usually boil down to complementary players that thrive when next to a true superstar. Major moves almost never happen in the modern NHL, which makes the events of June 29, 2016 all the more intriguing. In the span of less than 30 minutes, 3 major pieces of news broke, sending shockwaves throughout the league, the effects of which were seismic in nature and the consequences of which are only just now fully playing out. The moves made that day would directly lead to an MVP caliber season, 5 Cup Finals appearances, and 2 championship teams. It wasn't just a day to remember. It was the day the hockey world stood still. It seems like forever ago, but back in 2016, the Oilers weren't good. The Dark Age has taken a toll on both the team and fanbase. Having not made the playoffs since their famous run to the finals in '06, the team was desperate to find some level of success. Thankfully, the light at the end of the tunnel seemed to finally be in view. Due to the constant disappointment on the ice, they were able to land several high draft picks, and with it some rather intriguing young talent. Guys like Jordan Eberle, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Leon Draisaitl, a generational talent in Connor McDavid, and one Taylor Hall. There is one problem, however. They were loaded offensively. Maybe a little too loaded. The team had glaring weaknesses on defense and goaltending and needed to make a move to solidify these positions. Just the year prior, they'd sent a handful of picks to the Rangers for Cam Talbot to lock up the goaltending, but what else could they do for the defense? It seemed they were going after almost every big name out there, with rumors tying them to Kevin Shattenkirk, Justin Falk, Tyson Barrie, and John Merrill. They were supposedly very close in a deal for Matt Dumba, or trading down in the draft to select Mikhail Sergachev, and allegedly had a deal in place for Cody Ceci that was shot down by Senators ownership before it was made official. Despite all the rumors, nothing had come close, and then Oilers GM Peter Chiarelli was starting to get desperate. He knew his team's needs, and he knew he may just have to do something drastic in order to get it. And something drastic he did.
So today we traded Taylor Hall to New Jersey for defenseman Adam Larson. Significant trade for the Edmonton Oilers and for the New Jersey Devils.
The deal was 1-for-1. Edmonton would send former first overall pick Taylor Hall to New Jersey in exchange for defenseman Adam Larson. Reactions to the trade were mixed, to say the least. Yes, they were addressing a major need by acquiring Larson, but Taylor Hall was a budding superstar. He was just about to enter his prime at the time of the trade, had been a perennial 20-goal scorer, and was one of the key offensive pieces for the Oilers up to that point of his career. Did it get better for the Oilers at least? No. Not that it was Larson's fault, as throughout his time in Edmonton, you could easily argue he was their best defenseman. But throughout his entire time in Edmonton, the Oilers would only make the playoffs twice and would win a grand total of 1 playoff series. Their main weakness being ironically shaky defense and a lack of offensive depth. Then to add insult to injury, Larson would be lost to Seattle in the expansion draft, meaning Edmonton was left with exactly nothing from this trade. As for Hall and the Devils, well, at the time of the trade, the Devils were in their own dark age. After a finals run in 2012, they'd failed to make the playoffs ever since, and were hoping that Hall would give a much-needed boost to their fledgling rebuild. And give a boost he did. Through parts of 4 seasons in New Jersey, Hall averaged just under a point a game and led the team in scoring twice. The big breakout year came in 2018. Hall had a career year, setting new highs in goals, assists, and points, and dragged a severely underpowered Devils team to their first playoff appearance in 6 years. Despite a 5-game first-round exit, Hall's contributions that season earned him the Hart Trophy as league MVP. After injuries in 2019 led him to miss over half the season, and the team suffering from regression in 2020, Hall was traded to Arizona for a collection of futures that are still paying off to this day. He's now found himself a nice home in Chicago playing bodyguard to Connor Bedard. At the time this trade was made, you could argue that both teams were able to acquire exactly what they were looking for. Then again, neither team really achieved what they wanted to with the moves either. Edmonton would stagnate for years and have only just recently managed to shore up their weaknesses and get over the playoff hump, while New Jersey's accelerated rebuild had to effectively be redone. It was a move made out of desperation, and despite both teams seeing short-term benefits, eventually they'd both be forced to move on. It's a really fascinating move to look back on. Too bad it wasn't even the most impactful trade that day. Yes, I've received calls on PK, but I'm not shopping PK. I can tell you that. Those were the exact words then Canadiens GM Marc Bergevin gave to reporters on June 23rd. It's easy to forget now with how his career ended, but at one point in time, PK Subban was arguably one of the best defensemen in the world during his prime. He'd won the Norris Trophy as the league's best defenseman in 2013, and throughout the 2010s was second in defensive scoring on a powerhouse Habs team that proved themselves as a consistent playoff threat. But in 2016, the team took a big step back. After Carey Price's injury early in the season, Montreal was never able to recover. Subban himself seemed to regress as well, not necessarily offensively as he scored 51 points in 68 games, but without Price behind him to bail him out, his weaknesses on defense became much more apparent. So much so that heading into the trade deadline that season, rumors of a potential move had already begun to circulate, and they would continue to ramp up at the draft, with reports that Colorado, Edmonton, and Vancouver were all in on Subban at one point. Apparently talks with Vancouver went so far that a deal was in the works that would have seen them send the 5th overall pick to Montreal for Subban. The rumors did confirm one thing, however. Montreal was trying to get younger. Their core was aging, so trying to bring in some youth to electrify the team and maximize their window seemed like the best move on paper, which makes the actual trade all the more surprising.
We'll join our Eric Engels, who covers the Montreal Canadiens. Again, PK Subban going to Nashville in exchange for Shea Weber. Eric, your reactions to the trade?
Shea Weber was good. At that point in his career, he was already a 2-time Olympic gold medalist, a perennial Norris candidate, and the heart and soul captain that helped lead Nashville into a new era of success. But 1-for-1 for Subban? Montreal was already a struggling offensive team, so to trade away one of the best offensive defensemen in the game for a guy on the wrong side of 30 and who played a much more physically demanding game just seemed like a huge step backwards. Early returns seemed to back this up as well. Over the next 2 years after the trade was made, Nashville had arguably their greatest run of success. In 2017, immediately following this trade, they managed to make it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. They'd sweep aside the Blackhawks, upend the Blues, and knock out the Ducks on their way there, only to unfortunately lose in 6 to the Penguins. Then, in 2018, they'd win the President's Trophy as the best team in the NHL during the regular season and lose a hard-fought 7-game series to the Jets in the second round. All of this success came off the back of one of the best defensive cores in recent history. Subban, despite a drop in production, found himself thriving with his place in Nashville. Instead of being the main piece of the defense, he found a role that allowed him to play up to his offensive strengths, while guys like Roman Josi, Matthias Ekholm, and Ryan Ellis were able to shelter him on the defensive side. Having Pecorino behind them didn't hurt either. He was a consistent threat from their back end, was the quarterback of their power play, and was able to play as a complement to the offensive game rather than having it run through him. For Montreal and Weber, however, early returns weren't as successful. They would make the playoffs in 2017, but once again, their lack of offense would come back to bite them as they were bounced by the Rangers in the first round. Weber himself had a decent year with 42 points in 78 games, but would find himself sidelined for all but 26 games the next season as he suffered a foot injury. It would require surgery and cause him to miss most of 2019 as well. Even with the injuries, he would establish himself as a dependable veteran presence, a prominent figure in the locker room, and even ascend to captaincy after Pacioretty was traded to Vegas. In 2020, Montreal would even manage to fluke their way into a playoff appearance as the bubble allowed them to qualify as the 12th seed. They'd make the most of this appearance, however, as they beat the Penguins in 4 games during the qualifying round and put up a valiant effort as they lost a competitive series to the Flyers in 6. Weber himself had a bit of an offensive revival as he put up 3 goals in the run. And then came 2021. Absolutely nothing was expected of Montreal, yet with how weak the North Division was that year, they would sneak into the playoffs, finishing 4th in the division. And just like the year prior, they made the most of their opportunity. After the Leafs suffered their annual 7-game choke job, Montreal would dominate the Jets in 4 games as they swept them aside. Then, against a powerhouse Vegas team, one that absolutely should have crushed the Habs on paper, Montreal would pull off a historic upset as they take down the Knights in 6. The run would come up just short, however, as Tampa Bay would shut them down in 5. Weber himself proved to be a crucial piece throughout the run, as the captain would play through injury to lead his team on their historic run, and would even score in the series-deciding game against Vegas. Looking back on it, you could easily argue that both teams were able to extract the maximum value from each of the players they received. Both teams got a player who you could argue was their number 1 defenseman, and both teams were able to make the finals in their window. Unfortunately for both Weber and Subban, after their respective runs, neither player would ever be the same. In 2019, Subban would see a sharp decline in his production. It also didn't help that Nashville's power play fell flat on its face. Seeing the writing on the wall, he was traded to New Jersey for a bulk return. Once there, however, he would unfortunately continue to see his production fall and would retire at the end of the 2022 season. For Weber, playing through all those injuries in the 2021 playoffs took a toll on his body. As a result, he was placed on LTIR and was never able to return. With him now being unofficially retired, his contract would be sent to Arizona as a cap casualty. Both players came in with the expectation that they'd fill the void the other left, and both players did see their team achieve success many thought would be unattainable at one point. and both were unfortunately gone from the game far sooner than they should have been. On that fateful day, it was a seismic move that led to drastic outcomes in the NHL, and one that both teams have a reason to cherish forever. But as if things couldn't get any crazier, at 3:57 p.m. the biggest name on the free agent market came off the board. Heading into free agency, which was set to begin in just a few days, the speculation around Steven Stamkos and more importantly where he would sign was beginning to reach a boiling point. Rumors circulated the potential homecoming in Toronto, and at one point it seemed like Detroit had come out as the favorites for his services. But before we could even reach that point, the Lightning made the announcement that Stamkos had inked an 8-year, $68 million contract, keeping him in Tampa for the long term. And while the hockey world buzzed with excitement, let's not forget that at the time there were huge risks attached to this contract. Not necessarily in value, I mean an $8.5 million deal over 8 years looked like a massive steal even at the time. No, the risk for the Lightning came with Stamkos' injury history. Just a few years prior, he'd suffered a broken tibia, which forced him to miss half the season. Then just a few months before this contract was signed, Stamkos suffered from blood clots and was diagnosed with thoracic outlet syndrome. As a result, he was forced to miss all but one game of the 2016 playoffs, in which the Lightning bowed out in 7 to the Penguins in the conference finals. And if it seemed like it couldn't get any worse, just 17 games into this new contract, Stamkos suffered a torn meniscus that put him out for the remainder of the 2017 season, and the Lightning would miss the playoffs as a result. Thankfully, over the next 2 seasons, Stamkos was finally able to stay healthy, playing in all but 4 games in 2018 and managing a full 82-game season in 2019. Unfortunately, this was also the time in which the Lightning entered their choking era. In 2018, they were on the cusp of their second finals appearance in 4 years as they held a 3-2 series lead over Washington in the conference finals. They would then be shut out in back-to-back games as the Capitals upset Tampa en route to their first ever Stanley Cup. Then came 2019. During the regular season, the Lightning were arguably the best regular season team in NHL history. They'd set the record for most wins in a season with a 62-16-4 record. Nikita Kucherov won the Art Ross Trophy as league top scorer and the Hart Trophy as league MVP. Andrei Vasilevsky won the Vezina Trophy as the league's best goalie, and Stamkos himself set a new career high in points. Tampa had an absolutely historic season, one which would continue in the playoffs. For all the wrong reasons. In the first round, Tampa Bay would be matched up against the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team which at that point in time had never won a playoff series in their history, and despite going all in at the deadline had just barely squeaked into the playoffs. Then in their first round matchup, Columbus wouldn't just beat the Lightning, they would thrash them. After a big comeback in Game 1, Columbus would stomp all over Tampa for 3 straight games and win their first ever playoff series in their history. The goaltending fell apart, the high-end talent disappeared, and Stamkos could only manage 1 goal as everything else fell apart around him. It wasn't just an upset, it was a complete and utter embarrassment for the franchise. But somehow, the Lightning weren't fazed. In fact, the year after, it seemed like they'd finally gotten their act together. They'd take a step back in terms of record, but heading into the 2020 stoppage, they still held the second best record in the East. And when they got to the bubble, something just seemed to click for this team. Maybe it was the lack of fans. Maybe it was the shedding of demons by beating Columbus in the first round. But the Lightning seemed to have shed everything that held them back in years past and finally broke through to win their first cup since 2004. As for Stamkos' contribution, unfortunately, he wasn't able to deliver much. He had to undergo surgery for a core muscle and as a result was only able to play 5 shifts in total during the finals. But he was still as effective as he scored on his first and only shot of those playoffs. But after taking the proper time to recover, he would come back better than ever. In 38 games the next season, he put up 34 points. Then during the playoffs, he was just as effective as he managed 18 points in 23 games as Tampa Bay won their second straight cup. The year after, he'd have his first 100-point season and once again land Tampa to the finals, where unfortunately the dynasty would be denied as the Lightning would fall to Colorado in 6. Regardless, to say Stamkos has cemented his legacy in Tampa is nothing short of an understatement. Despite all the warning signs early on and severe underachieving, Stamkos was able to rally the Lightning to a level of dominance almost unprecedented in the modern NHL. Now with his contract up again, there are rumors that he could actually walk in free agency this time. But even if he chooses to do so, I'd say he's more than lived up to the lofty expectations set upon him when the contract was signed.
And so here we are, 8 years on, and all the moves made that day have played out and their effects on the hockey world seem to have reached their natural conclusion. As rare as major moves are in the NHL, the fact that we got 3 moves this impactful all before July 1st is something that really does deserve a deep retrospective. Especially with the heights that some of these teams managed to achieve, many could look back on it as proof that sometimes big swings can be worth it, and sometimes maybe even necessary. The day the hockey world stood still is one that lives on in the memory of fans everywhere, and like the moves that were made, will continue to do so for many years to come.